There is a fusion all the way to the modern time.
We'll have a little archaic revolutionary talk about a revolution that came and went.
Is it a fusion or a confusion?
Confusion.
Yes.
That's right.
Well, when last we left our intrepid heroes, we had just entered paragraph 15 of chapter 5. This is now week 138, and we're gonna dive deeper into paragraph 15. I've put up in the chat the last sentence of paragraph 14, the first sentence of paragraph 14, and the first sentence of paragraph 15. We went through all that last week. It's here just for reference. The link is in the chat as well. Actually, I think James joined after I shared the link, so let me just send James the link as well, because we all want to have access to the text so we can think about it our own selves. There we go. So where we are now is going into sentence 2, which, as Stephen forecast last week, is digging into the issue about whether religion is a public thing or a private thing. And Kenneth is gonna wrestle with this for a few sentences here.
Is it piety or vanity?
Yes, exactly the issue. But also, I mean, that's the liabilities of it. But also is the question of who does it serve? Does it serve to the capacity of human beings to form larger organizations like the polis, which is how the ancients conceived of it, or is the purpose the salvation of the individual soul, as the medieval epoch conceives of it? And that shift in focus has the consequences that Stephen just alluded to. So the liability is that if it's for personal purposes and then personal private purposes, and then you're Joe, you didn't have it either. Okay, let me share the link with you too. Everybody should have the link. There we go. So if it's intended to be private, if it's between you and God and saving your soul, then there is a risk of vanity if you take it public. Likewise, if it is to serve the purpose of making it possible for people to organize into a polis, that is, if religion is a public thing, but you take it private, you risk fragmentation, turning the cosmos of a healthy polis into the chaos of a disintegrating polis that's falling back into its constituent parts. So this is the theme that we're working with here, and all of this, required us to spend the last several weeks looking at the general question of religion and how the ancients conceived of it, which is why that's what we've been talking about. So Geneva's just joining. Let me share the link with Geneva as well. Hi, Geneva.
Hi.
Great to see you.
Good to see you guys.
Hi, Geneva.
Hi, I've missed you guys.
Likewise.
Yeah.
You're great, right? You look great.
Yeah, I'm 100% remission. Yay!
Oh,
Oh, that's great news.
Yeah,
Such great
I'm
news.
excited. I'm excited. Yeah. Yay!
So
Okay.
I'll just share it in the chat again. Here's the 3 sentences that we've been doing the last couple of weeks, and that was the end of paragraph 14, the start of paragraph 14, and the start of paragraph 15. And this sets up the background about how the ancients saw religion, as Kenneth Smith summarizes it. And what we're diving into this week is sentence 2, which starts to get into this question that Stephen forecast at the end of our last session about the difference between the ancients and the medievals in terms of whether they thought religion was a public thing or a private thing. What's its purpose? What is it supposed to accomplish? So, Michelle is joining too. Yeah, okay. I will need to share these with Michelle as well. Hi, Michelle. Welcome to the call. I'm going to share with you the link here to the text that we're working on. And then here are the sentences that we looked at the last couple of weeks. And here is where we're beginning our examination this week. Sentence 2. I've broken up sentence 2 because as As with some of Kenneth's sentences, it is a long, juicy sentence full of goodness, and we really need to take our time. We need to break it in half and deal with the components. So he starts out, prayer within the polis, we're talking about, the ancient Greek world, was a public thing, not a private thing. Because, and here comes L. Because religion was for the sake of political intelligence. Right, this is what we've been talking about the last several weeks. This issue that to the ancients, the purpose of religion is to help human beings cognitively mature to a state of being open to but suspicious of their parochial experiences and feelings on the one hand, and then open to but suspicious of their intellectual learning and their systems of thought and their logics and ideologies on the other. To recognize that each one has some value that it contributes, but each one is also a kind of mental trap. It can cause you to disregard the other half of what your brain's trying to tell you. And then you end up with these half-witted strategies, either parochial emotionalism or sort of abstractivizing, ideological thinking. And both of these things are damaging, even though each of them mostly thinks that it's the correct choice and the other one is the wrong choice. What the Greeks believe is that the adult, mature Homo sapiens mind is supposed to wield both of these faculties, like stringing a bow. You don't just use the wood and you don't just use the string. They don't do it half as much good as if you string them together into a dynamic system. So the purpose of religion was to help people. To the ancient Greeks, the purpose of religion was to help people grow through these stages of development to get to the point where they could use their mind dialectically, because only at that point can they think beyond their ideologies on the one hand and think beyond their emotional experiences on the other and start to think about what's for the good of the whole. What do other people feel and need, and what have they learned that you haven't learned, and how do governance requires this kind of egoless approach. And neither of the two half-witted approaches is egoless. Both of them are intensely egotistical, either intellectually egotistical or emotionally egotistical. And so, the Greeks believed we have to produce large, healthy population of people who have this dialectical mind, so that they can set aside their ideologies and set aside their parochial experiences and think about the bigger picture. And they said, without that, we're going to fail. It's going to be the collapse of civilization. So they saw religion as playing a fundamental metabolic function in the health of the polis. So that was the background we've had for the last several weeks. And given that, you can see why he'd say, opening up sentence 2 here, prayer within the polis was a public thing because religion was for the sake of political intelligence. This is a radically different interpretation of religion than we have in the modern world. And it's a radically different interpretation of religion than existed in the medieval world. In both contexts, religion is something completely different from what it was to the ancient Greeks. So I'm going to pause there for a sec for questions, comments, and concerns. I knew somebody would step forward. Phil, what's on your mind?
What's on my mind is that Heraclitus gave his writing to the temple of what's her name now? Artemis, right? Because Artemis exists between the polarity of Dionysus and Apollo. And it seems to me that most of the Greeks that we've read, put much more emphasis on Apollo, who was, after all, the bigger brother of Artemis. So in some sense, Artemis was a huntress, which means that she exists in the world. But she's also a muse, particularly of music, which means that she is already entering in the world of concepts, not like Apollo, but in a way of trying to enter it without negating the existential world. So that relationship between the conceptual relationship, harmonizing it with the existential world, seems to be kind of the middle ground in a way, because you can move back and forth in a way. And it seems to me like, particularly in Plato, which studying the Republic, they really emphasize the early training, at least, to have children train in music and then gymnastics, which seems like those are also, I mean, even gymnastics, the physical activity, but it is a sport, not violence, which is it's a kind of an art form, you know? I myself personally do not think that, well, maybe gymnastics is a little different, but all of the athletic issues are not the highest form of, let's say, art form, but they are an art form in itself. So in some sense, the fact that in the modern society we have so much de-emphasizing the arts, which is a very, very important part of the humanities, it's a it's really a way of saying that we're extracting ourselves away from that relationship between the existential world and the conceptual world. In fact, our conceptual world does exist in a way. You're trained to, let's say, uh, you know, to manufacturing, or you're trained to manage money. Those are abstractions that are, in some sense, incomplete in itself. So without the fact that we are uh, downplaying the humanities and particularly the arts, means that we're interested in itself dividing uh, the polis into people who can do the work and labor, and the people who can think abstractly, but neither of them have a total relationship to understanding of the dynamic relationship of the two. That was my comment. I mean, it's somewhat of a conservative hymn to Plato that he understand at least that part of early education, right?
Yes.
Before he ascends to the forms. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, we've talked before about this idea that the Olympic Games, the Nemean Games, the Isthmian Games, and the other one whose name I always forget, the four games that ran on 4-year cycles, so that there was one every year in a different location. These competitions were using
The Olympiads.
the Olympiads are one of them. The Isthmian and the Nemean are two of the others, and there's a fourth one. I always forget what the fourth one is. But anyway, there were four of these cycles, and each of them was on a 4-year cycle, and each of them was a year off from the others. And so every year there was a game, a set of games in ancient Greece. And during that period, war was banned. It was one of the few pan-Hellenic laws. If you didn't suspend your hostilities during the duration of the games, essentially, all the other polises and polities in Greece could declare war on you afterwards, because you were doing you were violating one of the sacred things. The sacred thing is we shouldn't fight all the time. Sometimes we should practice not conflict, but competition and the pursuit of excellence. And at these competitions, the highest forms of competition were the competing tragedies, where people like Sophocles entered their latest dramas to see, who could win the prize for making the most insightful, deepest explorations of human character. But those were side by side with the physical games, like Phil is alluding to, the sports where people are competing for excellence in jumping and running and wrestling and so on. And part of the reason for organizing it the way they did is that those physical competitions and the pursuit of excellence associated with them were something even the dimmest person could sort of get an understanding of and get excited about and experience vicariously or directly by entering in the games themselves. And that experience taught people what it feels like to be willing to discipline your life for the pursuit of excellence. And once you've experienced that in one part of your life, it then becomes possible for people to generalize and imagine applying the pursuit of excellence to other things. Not just how high can you jump, but how well can you write a drama, or how well can you govern, all these different kinds of, or music, all these different kinds of arete these gifts, if you will, that have to be cultivated, that the Greeks believed had to be cultivated to create a healthy culture. They needed to come up with an accessible way for the Greek population to acclimate themselves. Pythian, thank you, Sharon. The Pythian games, that's the one I always forget. And so they used it that way, like Phil's talking about. They used them in order to try to get people to think about there's the art of it and the discipline of it, what it takes to try to develop these individual gifts to the point that they can flower and become gifts that are available to the whole polis, to the whole culture. And pulling everybody together into these annual games was the part of the reason for that was to ensure that everybody could enjoy the fact that somebody had pursued excellence in the long jump or excellence in drama or what have you, lyric poetry. That practice, saying that nobody should live a life in which they only ever enjoy the pursuit of excellence vicariously. Everybody should be allowed, the culture should be organized in such a way that everybody has at least one part of their life where they can personally pursue the discipline that's required to develop an excellence in themselves. It's because we need, as human beings, to know what that feels like and to know what's required to do it, so that we can start to think about the adult life and not be trapped always in an infantilized way of life. The Greeks took this very seriously. They saw it as a sacred duty. It was all tied up with this. And that's why these games all had a religious cast to them. They were all sponsored by various deities, and the dramas were in honor of Dionysus. And they said so as they were presenting them. All of this stuff was holy sacred stuff, because this is how you cultivate human beings to be competent to create a polis and to govern themselves. It's interesting stuff going on here. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, pedantry. That second sentence of paragraph 15, where we say prayer within the polis was a public thing. I just thought that read funny, because you'd think maybe it was a public activity or a public whatever. But public thing is the sort of literal way that res publica gets rendered in English when people are being pedantic, because that's the Latin that we carry forward as republic. Not like, well, that's enough. I'm not sure. I think he's trying to say that this stuff carried into the Romans a bit too, by picking thing for his word there.
Yeah. I think you're right. And that's one of the ways in which the Romans, I talk a lot about how Kenneth says the Romans are a betrayal of the ancient ethos, but only gradually do they become increasingly a betrayal of the ancient ethos. They also exemplify parts of the ancient ethos. And what you're pointing out is one of the classic examples. If you watch the HBO series Rome, you can see how often the religious practices are just incredibly public. They're in front of everybody. And if you Google around a little bit and look at the Roman holidays and when they were celebrated, you'll see that the business of the Republic was repeated, and in the Empire, were repeatedly interrupted by these religious ceremonies over and over on a calendar throughout the year. And in fact, the structure of the calendar was a religious structure, which deities, which festivals, and so on. The Roman Republic, our inclination is to read backwards from the US Republic or the French Republic and see the Roman Republic as similar. But you're right. If you actually read it the way it was meant, the public thing that was the Republic was a religious thing. It was a shared set of observances that we were going to engage in. And that's what wove us together, so that instead of being a bunch of separate tribes, we became a unity that respected each other's, tribal affiliations and religions. They became everybody's shared religion.
I don't usually cite Rome, the TV series. I'll claim this all came from one of Mary Beard's books on Rome or something like that. But it is true that I think the leading families of the Republic had certain obligations to provide sons and daughters to staff the temples of and maintain the temples of the Republic, and took that, I think, seriously. I'm not sure, maybe corruptly, but also seriously.
Yes.
You know.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the corruption in Rome grows over time, but even during in fact, it's even more interesting to look at it in the corrupt period because they still care about their brand. And so they're still trying to create the appearance of doing it the legitimate way. And in some sense, the artifice associated with having to manufacture the false impression that they're as pious as they ever were helps to underscore how important they thought that piety was. It's like we've dispensed with many things, but we still desperately want to look pious because we don't know who we would be if we didn't have these shared religious practices. This is what the even in the age of corruption, this is what the Romans are teaching us. So it's quite fascinating to look at over that period. You're right. Thank you, Donald. I appreciate the pedantry. It's how many clues can we find, as we're trying to find the differences between our worldview and the ancient worldview. And yeah, language is totally up for grabs as a legitimate tactic to grab a thread and pull on it and see where it leads us. Res publica to republic is great. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I like those two sentences together, where it says ancient religion existed to further the culture of the polis, to serve as its foundation of piety. Then it says prayer within the polis was a public thing because religion was for the sake of political intelligence. And that, I think, the first part of the sentence, that's the most important part, because the public prayer was not understood by the people. And at the time, most of the prayers in the Roman Church, as it is in some very small places today, was delivered in Latin. And that's why we had all those stained glass windows in the churches. So that's the way the people understood their religion. So it was more of a sacred symbol rather than an understanding. And the public prayer, again, was more of manipulation and a political tool rather than anything else. You said something very interesting that caught my ears just as we started. You said the ancients saw religion or the practice of religion or divinity very different than the medievals and the moderns. And I think the medievals and the moderns, and I don't know which philosopher talks about this, they politicize. And even in today's world, in the country we live in today, I read with fascination as the election of Trump and the Catholic Church was all behind him. And, there was a lot of dictum. And I have friends who are Catholic, and some of them went along with it until he cut the funding to the Catholic Church for the refugees. Then all of a sudden, the politics comes in and they're distancing themselves. Now, that's very bothersome because that's no different than the medieval times. And I think that carried over from the medieval times to now. And religion is still a very, very political tool, aside from the piety. The piety, in my eyes, is by the way.
Thank you, Sharon. It's one of the interesting differences between the ancient and medieval epochs is that, in ancient Rome, Latin was the language of the people. So when services were held in Latin, everybody understood it. That was the vernacular. So it's a fascinating change when we go from the ancient epoch to the medieval epoch. We see, even during the late Roman Empire, you see the majority of people aren't speaking classical Latin; they're speaking vulgar Latin, but they're still very close. I mean, it's closer than Spanish and Portuguese. You can understand each other quite clearly. But by the time Rome collapses and communication breaks down across what used to be the empire, the languages begin the vulgar Latin spoken in different places begins radically diverging until you start to get Proto-French and Proto-Italian and Proto-Spanish and so on, Proto-Romanian. And these languages become mutually unintelligible. And so that's how you get this status arising in which the church services are being delivered in a sort of a fossilized or semi-fossilized form of a language that isn't the vernacular anymore, and people don't speak anymore. And so this gulf opens up that didn't exist in the ancient world. This gulf opens up between, the speech of the priests in formal ceremonies and the speech of the everyday people who are listening to or participating in those ceremonies. And so Latin ceases to be our language and becomes that holy sacred language. It's a fascinating change, and it's probably part and parcel of this sense of there's a disenfranchisement that happens with the religious services when they cease to be in the vernacular, and when the holy texts themselves, the Bible, is written in Latin, and people can't read and write Latin anymore because literacy was very high, relatively high during the Roman Empire. Everybody could at least do their names, and most people could do more than that. Functional literacy was at least 50%. But by the time you get well into the medieval epoch, literacy has collapsed. So on the one hand, literacy's collapsed, and on the other hand, even if they were literate, it wouldn't be in Latin because that's not their everyday language anymore. So this gulf arises that allows the managers of the religion to kind of have their way, if you will, with the ceremonies and with the sacred texts without the larger population being able to evaluate whether they agree or not. So that sense that religion is something that belongs to a specialized caste is interesting, because in the ancient epoch, the different aspects of religion, the different ceremonies, belonged personally to each tribe that had fused together to make up the polis. Each different tribe had their own ceremonies; they had their own calendar. I think it was Donald made an allusion to this. So if we go back, he gave an example from the Romans, but let's go back to the Greeks. Heraclitus himself in Ephesus, his family, were not just the ruling family, but they were also from a specific tribe, and that was responsible for the Eleusinian mysteries. So whenever there was a festival that was about the Eleusinian mysteries, Heraclitus and his brother and his family would be the ones to come up and run it so the priesthood overlapped with individual membership in tribes. They weren't seen as a completely separate caste as much. But by the time you get to the medieval epoch, or even the late Roman, as Donald points out, people are giving up family members to become part of the priesthood, which is seen as somewhat separate from the people. And by the time the medieval epoch happens, that separation becomes complete, becomes an entirely different class in society that's ruling people in general. It's an interesting transformation. And it's hard for us to think back to what would it mean if you didn't have a whole separate class of priests. What if priest was just a role that you took on and put off? Like the way you can join the internet church, Universal Life Church, and then you can marry your friends to each other. You can do that today, but a lot of people think that feels weird. It's like not quite a real kind of priesthood. But in some ways, that's closer to the original priesthood from the ancient epoch, when it was a role that you had. It wasn't necessarily a separate class. It depended on your time and place. Michelle, come off mute. Welcome to the call. Tell us what's on your mind.
As I was perusing, I slightly perused the pages you gave me to read, and I was looking for something specific, didn't find it. But I'm wondering how, when Constantine changed the official religion of Rome from the ancient religion to Catholicism, how that affected the religious nature to the poultice and politics, and also what happened to the games.
Yes. It's so two very interesting questions there. And it's something that we're going to be exploring for months. It's not something we'll be able to answer in short. And part of the reason is that there's not a nice clean dividing line. I mean, we adopt one conventionally. We say the fall of Rome is the nice clean dividing line between the ancient epoch and the medieval epoch. But the truth is that the medieval epoch, the seeds of the medieval epoch and the roots and sprouts of it, go back for centuries before that. I mean, just ages. And likewise, survivals of the ancient epoch, continue to this day. But if you were to try to look for major survivals, you'd have to say that it's difficult to say that the old Roman system has 100% collapsed until the fall of Constantinople. Especially when the state before the invasion by the Turks, when the Crusades sack Constantinople, one Christian group sacking another Christian group. That's sort of the equivalent of the burning of the Library of Alexandria, because much of the texts of the Library of Alexandria were not burned when that library was burned, but were actually taken long before that to the Great Library of Constantinople. So Byzantium, Constantinople remains the center of kind of ancient tradition and language and practices. It sort of semi-medievalizes until the Crusades really burn and sack much of what's left, and then the last dregs of it are pretty much gone when the Turks batter down the walls and take it and make it Istanbul. So the point of this is to say there's this huge overlap, and it lasts over 1,000. There's over 1,000 years of overlap. So maybe closer to 1,400 years of overlap in these ways between the ancient and the medieval. This is part of the Hegelian approach to history, where he says, rather than having these tidy, abstract intellectual categories, and we insist everything stay on one side of the line or the other, we look at the changes in history the way that we look at biological development. So at what point does the bud cease to be a bud and become a blossom? Well, there's various points you might draw the line at, but it's clearly there's blossomness before that line and there's budness after that line, and it's the same with the blossom transforming into the fruit. It's a complicated process. What Constantine does when he makes Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire, it's certainly a powerful catalyst for change, but it's also building on change that's already been happening for centuries. And it's not capable of changing everything. Many things still continue afterwards. So I know that's not a nice, clean answer, but I suspect it's as close as I can come in a few seconds to trying to put my finger on the issues. And then as far as the games go, I don't actually know when the Olympian Games ended, when the Pythian Games ended, and so forth, the Isthmian. I don't know the dates of that, and I should look that up. What I do know is that many ancient practices carried over into Rome. So, for example, there were empresses, or let's say relatives of the emperor, who significantly sponsored, for example, the Oracle at Delphi. There was a big rebuilding program. There was a stage where they went back to Delphi and replaced. There was a giant epsilon, looks like a letter E. There was a giant epsilon up on the front. Was one of the engravings on the Oracle, on the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, and it had been wood for ages and was replaced by gold by one of these people. There were these constant kind of rehabilitation programs where they would go back and try to pour into it. Now that stuff starts to dry up around the time that Constantine makes Christianity the state religion. So there is, I think what we can point to is there's sort of an acceleration of the decay of the ancient ethos and worldview that happens from that point forward. And it's an inflection point more than it's a black and white before and after. So that would be my summation, such as it is, for now. But we'll talk about this in a lot more detail in the months ahead as we go. It's going to take about 1.5 years to work our way through these chapters. So, because we spent 2 years just on chapter 4 because that was our discussion of the ancient epoch. The plan is to spend about 2 years on the next 5 or 6 chapters, which are about the medieval. Geneva, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, like Sharon, I like that first sentence in paragraph 15. Prayer within the polis was a public thing because religion was for the sake of political intelligence. And I have been watching that series that you mentioned, Rome, which is really good, really interesting anyway. And it seems to me the problem I guess that I'm having is the term religion, because with the people in that TV series, they're all sort of worshiping, various and sundry gods and goddesses, but they do it on their own. It's not like a collective thing. Like they have little idols or emblems in their houses. Outside, they can go outside. So it's not like they all go to church. And I guess that's where it's like, is there a better word than religion? Because I think I've been tainted by the term religion,
Yes.
thinking that, we all have to go to church and we all have to listen to the goddamn preacher and listen to
Yes.
how he interprets things, and then we have to give them money. That's not what they were doing. They
Yes.
were individually, worshiping their gods and goddesses on their own, and they had their little rituals and so forth. And that I could understand. Almost by that series, sex could have been a religion of sorts, because everybody's having sex and they're doing it outside, and just like they were praying. It's like, whoa, this is interesting. So I
Yes.
guess I kind of have a reaction to the term religion, but I like the
Yes.
concept. So yeah.
Those are great comments, Geneva. So let's talk about this from a couple of angles. One of them is we have to remember that the writers of Rome are moderns, so they think that religion to the Romans meant more or less what it means to us, and they think that because moderns have a very hard time thinking outside the modern framework. It's the we're the most objective and scientific and the culmination of history and we're right stuff that we're all indoctrinated with that makes it extraordinarily hard to think about ancients as or medievals or any other past epoch as anything other than a primitive version of ourselves. We always want to show that they might be interesting and exotic, but we still want them to be a stepping stone on the way to the great march of progress that leads to our glorious selves. So even people who mean well and do the best scholarship they can almost always recast ancient religion into a modern form. So here's some examples of that. If you've given where you're at in the series, how much of it you've seen, you must have seen Julius Caesar's triumphal return to Rome, where he's all dressed in red, he's on the chariot, and he's like the god Mars. So that is portrayed in Rome almost completely accurately. That's what it would have looked like and felt like, and all those people would have been present. The part that's missing is to the modern writer, and therefore to the who created that script, and therefore to the viewer who's watching the episode, it's mainly a political, military ceremony, right? Look at me, I won. Now you all have to celebrate me. But what actually happened was a religious ceremony. I am invoking the god Mars. Of all the pantheon, Mars is smiling upon us. And we should, if we grant Mars more of our focus and attention, then Rome will spread and be glorious. And my victories merely illustrate the importance of the god Mars, which is why I dress up as him. So that entire thing is a public religious ceremony. But the writers don't quite appreciate that. And so they make
Well, I
it
think
look
you
like
kind of get that sense, though, just from
yeah.
the way that it's portrayed.
Yeah.
And the concept that he won't kill the two warriors because they must have powerful gods on their side. And
Yes.
therefore, he's not going to mess with those two because they've survived this and this and this. And so there's powerful gods on their side. So
That's
you
right.
kind of get that sense, even though it could be taken politically. But I kind of get that it's more. I just don't like the term religion. I guess
Yes.
that's a personal
No, we
situation.
all
So
have that
yeah,
issue, right? We all
yeah,
have that issue that religion has, it carries this freight of meaning for us, and it's very
yeah,
hard for us to apply it when it seems to be in violation of that freight of meaning. And what you're putting your finger on here is this issue that we talk about a lot, where we see that all of the most important loaded terms, whether it's religion or free will or determinism, or responsibility or God or nature,
God,
all
yeah,
of these terms mean something radically different to the moderns than they meant to the medievals, than they meant to the ancients. And so we have this huge cognitive impedance mismatch when we try to have even the most ordinary conversations about the things that matter, because they also used some version of the terms, but they used them to mean something completely alien
yeah.
what we mean. So let's talk about the personal and the private. In a traditional Okinawan martial arts dojo, in addition to the big floor, where everybody's practicing, and maybe some mirrors where you can see yourself and check your form, and maybe there'd be some trophies or banners and things like that, they would have a small station on one end of the hall that had a few little, like maybe plaques, and maybe a cup, one with rice in it and one with sake in it, and there might be incense sticks, and that's a small pocket shrine, and it's derived from Buddhist and Shinto practice. You can find them in traditional households throughout Japan, where every house was also expected to be a temple, and it's where and the purpose of the temple was to remember your ancestors, and to treat the home not just as a secular object, but as a sacred place that you were trying to keep clean and you were trying to respect, and remember that it's keeping you alive, so you want to keep it alive. There was this whole sense of there's more going on in the creation of a household than just let's get some stuff and put it in some convenient place. Um, so in the same way, every Roman home had in its I'm not necessarily using the right word, the atrium, when you enter, you pass through a little entryway and you enter a court. And there's a lot of rooms around the outside of the court, and they might include, the kitchen, and might be the bathing room and so forth. But the court itself typically is collecting water from the sky. There's a pool in the center they were big on rainwater collection. And at some place, somewhere in that court, there will be, just like in the traditional martial arts dojo or Japanese home, there'd be a little shrine. And that shrine would have a mix of little plaques or remembrances of your own ancestors, and then something representing this home as having its own little sort of guardian angel overseeing it. And then maybe you would also pick a handful of the official deities. Maybe there'd be a plaque to Venus, and maybe there'd be, if it was Julius Caesar's home, doubtless there's one for Mars, right? It's like, ooh, Mars, making my career go. They'd have a few like that. It'd be a mix of the public and private and be put somewhere. So every single visitor to your house can, as just in the process of entering, is confronted with the mix of the secular and the sacred sort of blended together in this combination that's a little uncomfortable for a modern. Can't quite put our finger on. Are they being religious or not being religious? Is it a public thing or a private thing? And the answer is some of both. They're kind of blending a little bit. So, but I think one other example that's really useful is the ceremonies of I think it's Artemis Brauronia. Artemis has a bear, has a great she bear, and you think, wait, this is the woman who's running around in the woods with a bow and arrow, hunting and stuff, but she's also a bear, and they're going, yeah, sure, why not? Sometimes she's a bear, and that happened because there was a small Greek tribe that worshipped her in the form of a bear, and they had their own ceremonies. And when the Greeks were trying to weld themselves together from a bunch of tribes into a giant pan-Hellenic federation, they couldn't just suppress those groups and those practices, because if they did, those people wouldn't join. Sorry, this is our religion. You can't tell us to put it aside. So instead, they just fold it in and say, okay, on the calendar of ceremonies that we do every year, on this one date in this one place, Artemis is a bear, and all the girls go dress up in bear costumes and they do bear-like stuff, and that's the religious ceremony. And people who aren't from that tribe are certainly welcome to go and watch and maybe even participate if they can do so respectfully. But so on the one hand, it's part of their shared religion, and on the other hand, it's part of their tribal religion or private religion. But the public religion, because it's this fusion of multiple threads, is having to leave space for these private practices. So it's weird, right? Among the ancients, because of their sort of a cosmopolitan approach to welding together lots of different groups, it becomes difficult to make the usual distinctions between public and private. But what Kenneth's talking about in this sentence, when he says it's a public thing, is he's saying that and this is a point Stephen has made off and on over the years that we've been doing this, is that to the ancients, religion was seen as something without which the polis couldn't survive. There could be no such thing as a strictly secular polis. They didn't believe in it. They didn't believe in strictly secular government. They didn't believe in strictly secular education. But none of those things was possible. And they said the reason it's not possible is because the polis lives or dies by its ability to cultivate a sophisticated adult human minds capable of governance. That's a sacred duty that we have to cultivate people to be able to do that. And it's also a necessary prerequisite for the survival of us as a group. And so therefore it crosses the boundaries between public and private in that way. It's public in that it is a necessary public good, like having an aquifer. If you don't have water, you're not gonna have a polis, right? I'm sorry. It's just a public good. If you don't have fresh air, you're all gonna die. So it's a public good. And so they saw religion as being the same kind of thing. It has to happen, it has to be there. But that doesn't mean nobody prayed in private and nobody, did those other things as well. But it's great questions, Gina. I mean, that's really right on the money. And you're right. This word religion, what exactly does it mean is going to be a problem for us as we cross the boundary from ancient to medieval. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was fascinated by what Donald brought up, and I was looking at transformation from a public thing to a public affair. And I was wondering what that transformation meant. It seemed like when it transferred into public affair, it seems like it's a managed thing, So therefore, it becomes the property of the state to a certain degree, rather than I would have preferred that the first one was not a public thing, but a public event, in which just sort of happens. So from a public event to a public affair, it seems like as a management. And I was thinking, well, perhaps it doesn't apply to the Olympics, to the Olympics itself, the original Olympics, but it seems to me the Roman thing about any kind of event is filled with spectacle. So it also transforms it from just an event that happens, putting the focus on the thing itself, and also the participation. Even people who are in the audience is part of the participation. But a spectacle becomes, you just go to not even to watch the event, but the spectacle that happened. That's why you have the Colosseum where people actually kill each other, right? Like, how exciting. I mean, like, people actually die. I mean, it's like, wow, thumb up, thumb down. It's like that thing about the spectacle, it seems to draw it away from the thing or the event, you know. So it's already highly managed and manipulated to a certain degree, control, and professional. These are not just ordinary athletes that become whatever it is, and it becomes sort of like uh, they're very, very good at what they do, and they're willing to die for what they do. But an ordinary person doesn't stand a chance against, one of these uh, these participants who are professional. That's all they do. They don't participate in other things. Then I begin to wonder whether the modern Olympics, in some sense, even though we lost the religious thing about it, has transformed from an amateur event to a professional event. That seems like, and I was thinking back, especially, and I admire Fosbury, do the Fosbury flop. I mean, that strictly has something to do with a kind of inbred aesthetic that has to do with the height rather than just sort of jumping over. Because I could just imagine the regular skill you need in the forest or whatever is you're jumping over things, but you don't land on your back so the bear could just eat you up. I mean, like that. That's such a technical thing that it doesn't have any application to life, but it's a very, very uh, interesting, and so it's just a measure of how high you could jump even in the most abstract way. So that's sort of interesting too. So it's like, so we have a way of transforming that so it's no longer about, like like what the steeplechase is closer to a real jumping event. You run around, then you jump over this thing, and you try to get to the next, on. It's like that's what real jumping is. I don't think when you're being chased by a lion, you're going to do the Fosbury flop. You're dead for sure. So even though you are jumping higher than anybody who does Western roll or just jumping over a fence, that's it. It just seems like this whole thing has become so professionalized and abstracted, and to the degree that it's also more about spectacle and spectators. Like, oh yeah, we just saw Fosbury
Yes.
this flop is like it's incredible height, right?
Yes.
So yeah. So I think that transforms it from an event to a kind of a close to a spectacle in a way. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, Phil. The transformation from religion as something we do together, which is like the Greek mystery
Mhm.
religions, or something we do together, and then we don't speak of them, right? They swore the participants of the Eleusinian mysteries to silence, which is why we still to this day don't know everything that happened in them. Many people talked about them. Nobody fully documented what happened. We only know little fragments. So on the one hand, you've got this idea of participatory religion, our religion, the religion of our group or our family or our tribe, and that the state has a duty to create a space within its schedule for us to do our thing. And other people can watch, but we can't be suppressed. We have to be part of it. But on the other hand, by the Hellenistic period, under the Macedonian Empire, you've got a new era of engineering coming along. Archimedes and others are discovering these laws of mechanics. And part of the way that they're making their money is they're being paid by temples to do things like create doors to the temple that seem to mysteriously open without any human being touching them. Right? They're using water dripping through, running through, hidden pipes that go down and hydraulically push the doors so that they open. They're using all kinds of tricks and techniques like this to steam engines that are not being used to create an industrialized civilization, but are just being used to create special effects in a temple. As the temple transforms from a place where we do our participatory religion, it starts transforming into a place of spectacle, like you're saying, where we go to see amazing things happen and maybe donate some money or something. This transformation from participant to audience member, spectator, is already taking place. In fact, even under the Delian League, right before the Peloponnesian War, after the Persian War in Greece, part of Athens' claim to fame is that when the war is over, they're diverting the funds and using them to make Athens glorious, visually glorious. They're making their temples amazing. They're making their statues amazing. They're trying to increase the spectacle value of Athens. And there's allusions to it in Pericles' speeches in the Peloponnesian War, where he's talking about how come we can only collect revenues to be used in the pursuit of death, fighting against the Persians. Why can't we collect tax revenues for the pursuit of life and to glorify, Greece? His appeal appears on the surface to be about other things, but one could easily read into it that he wants spectacle. He wants not just religious participation, but religious spectacle. He wants people to feel a sense of awe, and majesty associated with the state. And if the Dalian League revolts and stops paying their taxes, even though the war ended long ago, he won't be able to keep, building these glorious projects that make people rock back on their heels in awe. So this idea of which is the purpose of religion? Is it for us to have a gnosis together, to experience and transform ourselves and unite together by having, transformed together? Or is the purpose to awe and shock spectators so that they'll, be compliant and give us money? This is a tug of war that's going on, starting in the classic age of Greece and boy by the Roman Empire times, and it's gone hard in that direction. The medieval Gothic cathedrals, by the time we get to there, it's really clear that they're pushing hard in the direction of, we want you to walk in the door and be, knocked on your ass by how vertical it is, how everything seems to point to heaven, by the glorious light coming in through the stained glass windows. Shock and awe is clearly the point, and they're hoping that the shock and awe will dilate your soul and make you open to God on the one hand. But on the other hand, they get into the whole buying and selling of relics and, come look at the finger bone of, Saint so-and-so. This is clearly about collecting revenue from pilgrims by that point. So there is the transformation you're talking about just gets more intense. Is it a participatory event, or is it a spectacle? Thanks for bringing that up. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, so I'm just going to mention a few things that in this period, of course, Constantine came to power early in the 4th century and made the Christian religion legal, but it was a minority religion at the time. And it wasn't until Theodosius became emperor that finally, that Christianity had really become the dominant. You have this entire period where there were the pagans and the Christians, and various heresies were generally tolerated. There was a period where all these different views were allowed to go. Now, the interesting thing that I never realised was that the Constantinian dynasty went towards Arianism. Theoretically, the Catholics had one favourite, that Nicene conference, but about 10 years after that, Constantine went over to the Arians. And this is something you find, that that whole dynasty was dominated by Arian views. So the emperors were heretics at that period. And so heresies were tolerated, but Christianity would like us to think Constantine came to power and the temples were overturned. But that didn't happen with Constantine. That happened at the end of the century with Theodosius. I assume you've watched that movie Agora about Hypatia, which you got to watch out with movies. They're full of inaccuracy, but colourfully it illustrates a point. In 393, I think in general, was around that year that suddenly they turned on the pagan temples and tore them down or appropriated them for the church. So until that sort of date, the pagan temples existed there. They might have been closed, they might have lost public revenue, but there was still a small core of people that were maintaining the practice there. They were torn down and public practice of the pagan religion was banned. Now, the interesting thing I, of course, didn't think about was that you were still allowed to have a private confession of a pagan for a generation after the temples were torn down. You've thrown the priest out of his home, but often these priestly figures, these pagan priests, were still highly respected. They still had a lot of friends. And it wasn't until about 425 that the private confession of paganism was banned. So that it was a gradual process. But in regards to religion, we see the transformation in our own modern period where our view of the universe changed. Newton comes along with his mechanics, and it's almost immediate. It's within a generation or so that people had been they no longer viewed religion in the same sense, because you go back to ancient times that religious practice was always about gaining the favour of the powers that could affect your fate, either privately or publicly. When there were public demonstrations of religion, in a sense, you were calling upon the beneficence of the gods. You're saying, you know, we're Athens, help us win the next war. We're the good guys anyway, you know that. We're demonstrating this by our, you know, our piety. The other guys, they're the bad ones, you know. But this seems to be the transformation that we see with Newtonian mechanics very rapidly in, say, a place like England. The view had become that there were mechanical laws ruling the universe. And you could go and pray all your like, you're not going to change the mechanical laws. Now, this mysterious period where there was this transition from the very ancient pagan to an era of rationalism in Socrates, there was a transition there. There was somehow, prior to the Socratic periods, prior to the Axial Age, there was somehow a completely different thought pattern from one we could understand. We might meet Socrates, and here for us modern, Socrates is something we can understand. But if we go back too far in the past, we're not understanding what is driving these people. Us moderns would be confused. So there's been this, this transition about fate, about what causes things to happen, about causation. And when causation is mysterious, religion is the rage. Public religion is the rage, because, well, you want a good harvest, there's actually sentient powers which can determine whether you have a good harvest or not. You better be on their good side. And this seems to be the transition, and our modern era has transcended again. And it seems what's happened is there's a type of humanism at rule now, that they've made the concept of the perfect, most virtuous human being the God that is above us all. This is the current religion. It's not like the Christian religion that said, look, it's never going to be anything like a perfect human being. Forget it. Just hopefully God can overcome your fallibility and you can go to heaven. But this, our modern cult is the cult of reason, the cult of humanism, the idea that we can find a perfect answer to everything, that we can create a perfect existence. Our religion, if all religions are mad, our religion is just as mad as those in ancient times. But this seems to be the transition. So this is a question now. If I go and pray to the gods, oh, you know, make my harvest better. Well, that would be just vanity, wouldn't it? It's no longer piety. It's vain, because there's no control over the forces of nature to plead with. There's no art of the deal with the forces of nature. Maybe if there were imaginary gods or whatever ruling over it all. And this thing where we believe that our mind can contact some mental God who's going to, for the sake of our piety, change our fate, is what the change seems to have been around.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, you see this big split between, to the ancients in their earlier form, is the purpose of religion that we make ourselves mindful, we pray to make ourselves mindful of, how the cosmos works, and to try to understand so that we can harmonize our lives and our societies with the greater order of nature. That's a different kind of prayer than the prayer that says, if I'm faithful enough, I can compel God to do what I want and not what somebody else wants. You see this in all the time in modern sports, where someone says, you know, we won because God was on my side. I prayed, I'm a godly, I prayed to God, and so we won. And in that is sort of that weird parochial blindness that says, do you think the other team also did not pray? Do you think God likes you more than he likes the other team? I mean, that's the problem with the whole, I want it to rain on me and not my neighbor so that I can
Well,
have
that's
good
a
crops and
Dave
he
Allen
doesn't.
joke, isn't it? If you recall Dave
Yeah.
Allen.
Yeah.
The two kings, medieval kings, one's praying to God, and then the other side, the other's praying to God. And Dave Allen's God, and he tosses a coin.
Right. Right. I mean, how's God supposed to choose which team's prayers are the good ones, and so I'll let them win. So there's these
But
huge splits between religion as understanding and harmony on the one side, where I'm the one who changes. I change my understanding so that my behavior harmonizes, versus prayer that's designed to change God and make God do what we want him to do. Um,
not
it's
quite. The ancient pagan religion certainly had that element very strongly of gaining the god's favor. But this other aspect that your behavior must mirror what is cosmically good
Mhm.
is there as well.
Yes.
Obviously, you have to be pious to gain favor of the gods. You
Yes.
can't go out and say, I'll give you the art of the deal, my God, and then go and act in the most atrocious manner.
Right. Right.
But that was even in Christianity as well. They believed
Yes.
that God's going to become angry if you behave in a bad manner. But at the same time, you're pleading with God for a better fate.
Yes. Exactly. So
But
these tug of wars are
what are
happening.
us moderns doing? Because we have decided that the laws of the universe are mechanical and cannot be interceded with.
Right. Right. It changes everything, doesn't it? Yeah. And it reflects that mythos to logos transition that we talked about a couple years ago. It's when you think of a mythos cosmos, anything's possible. But when you think of a logos cosmos, you think the cosmos is constrained by the rules as I understand them. And therefore, in a sense, I'm in charge of the universe because it can't behave differently than I think it does.
Well, you get to Nietzsche, who says, well, look, the good guy can go down and suffer the worst fate, but the evil guy might prosper.
Right. 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 These cause major problems for people's theologies and theogonies. So thanks for bringing it up, Stephen. So I'm going to call on, is it Michelle or Michele, or how would you like to pronounce your name? Come off mute and tell us that, and then tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, Michelle.
Michelle. Okay, got it.
I'm wondering, and I bet Stephen will be able to answer this as well, because he said Theodosius, I'm not Theodosius. And I'm betting that that's right around when more penalties, and the penalties were probably instituted for if you still worshipped and honored the Greco-Roman gods. But I'm wondering what kind of penalties, such as torture, and unto the death penalty, punishment by death, was instituted, and when to who weren't actually worshiping Jehovah or Yahweh.
Oh, there's actually a list of imperial edicts governing worship, and it's a long list going throughout the 4th century into the early 5th about your public practices. But there might have been a penalty of death, or there might have been a fine, or a loss of property. But at the end of it, for a while, only public displays of pagan faith were banned. You were still allowed for a while to be privately a pagan. This happened with the Vikings as well. When they converted, there was still a period where you were allowed to sacrifice or whatever to the pagan gods in private, but not in public.
When it was all put off, when all pagan worship was banned in private or in public or in private, if you and the death penalty was instituted for such worship of the pagan and Greco-Roman gods, were there lesser penalties and fines if you were a higher ranking official of state?
Well, not always death. Death is one penalty, but other penalties, for example, were the loss of property. Your property could be appropriated. Your ability, inheritance laws, for example, you couldn't will your property to somebody else if you weren't following the appropriate religion anymore. There was all these rules. I'll try and dig it out. I'll see if I can find it. It's on the net somewhere, which just bang, bang, yeah, so-and-so, yeah, this was banned. Yeah, more penalties, blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did they answer your question, Mitchell?
Michelle. Yeah. Yes, it did. Oh, but it's only in that you left out when the death penalty, I'm sure even torture at some point in time was probably instituted as well. But like even when the death penalty was enforced to a really high degree for like even all offenders almost. If you were a high-ranking official, could you get out of the death penalty almost like very easily?
It wasn't. The death penalty wasn't universally applied. There were certain heresies which really attracted the death penalty. It was actually Christian heresies they were more worried about than the pagans.
Yeah.
Anyway,
some of
I'll
that happens at
see
the
if I can
end.
dig out the list.
Some of that happens more at the end of the medieval epoch or right after the medieval epoch rather than at the beginnings. Like Giordano Bruno is taken out for a Christian heresy, and that's 1,000 years later. So it varies from time and place, like Stephen's saying. But I think what we see in all of this discussion that's well worth kind of spotlighting is that prior to these edicts, the way ancient religion worked was it was inclusive. The Romans, when they'd conquer new territory, added the local religions to their religion. They didn't stomp it out. It was unthinkable. And to the concept of ancient religion, you had no business telling the gods they did or didn't exist. But starting in 393, as Stephen's saying, and accelerating, you get this new approach to religion that really was the exception previously. And that's the notion of religious genocide and purity, that there can be only one and all the others have to be exterminated. And that change, that inflection is such an enormous inflection that I would think that's almost as important a dividing line as the fall of Rome, which happens later. To the point when they start instituting religious genocide is in some ways the end of the old order. Because that just wasn't done before. I mean,
well, if you went to a foreign land, it seems that people often wanted to gain the favor of the gods that ruled in that land. Yeah. We don't want to make enemies of the gods.
Yeah.
It's hard enough having a fight with the locals and also having their gods come down on us.
Yes. Yes. I like to contrast, what the Romans did when they're busy conquering Gaul and Britannia, and they're building temples to the local gods that they did not themselves previously believe in. And these temples are marble. I mean, they're going to incredible expense to create these temples to gods that were not previously part of their religion. But you jump forward to Charlemagne and that era, 800 and so on. And now that you're deep in the medieval period, when the Christians would conquer a pagan area, they would raise the temples to the ground and build a Christian temple on top of the spot to prevent the pagans from secretly coming back to the ruins and worshiping. They're trying to completely erase and eradicate any trace of the old religion. So these are like worlds apart. And this goes to Geneva's point about, well, which of these counts as a religion? I mean, what is the essence of religion? Well, it can obviously be incredibly variable because these are opposite reactions to how religions interact with each other. And yet ostensibly they're both called religion. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. Oh, you are off mute.
Yeah, I was thinking about what Stephen said about Newtonianism. Really, it's about the withdrawal of God in a funny way. Because if the ancient religions, God is very present or immanent. I mean, they're very nearby, because of the forces of nature. I mean, it's around you. When there's an earthquake, something's happening. When there's a storm at sea, something's happening. I mean, the gods are part of it in a way. So they're directly intervening in your life in a funny way. But when you got to the Christians, you have had a problem because you had a transcendent God. Very, very far away, but very powerful. And I think the Christians sort of solved it by having the third man, which is Christ, who was both a man and a God. So he mediated between them. But when you got to somebody like Newton, of course, the development of science, Newton was really kind of a compromise. He wasn't Nixon God and providing like science would be the answer to everything. He was a deist. The deists believed that God did create the world, but he withdrew from it to let man's intellect develop. And there was a very, very famous painting. I forgot who it was, uh, but kind of a early romantic painter who painted Newton drawing the compass to describe the world. He was retracing the efforts of God, and God, once he created the universe, he could withdraw. And so God was becoming very distant, but his presence was there in the traces, and it was mankind's uh, uh, not ability, but mankind's need to retrace uh, the uh, the handiwork of God to come to know it. So that was kind of a compromise because deism was showing that God, once he created a world, he's going to withdraw. He's going to be very far away, and you're going to have to find your own way and retrace that. I think it was then the Romantics reacted against that because that early Romantic painting was very interesting because as Newton was retracing the handiwork of God. So he was both honoring Newton, but he was also seeing that Newton was not looking at the world, the riches of the world, but only looking at the abstractions of the creation of the world. So God was both distant, but he was not paying attention to how the world really is. So it was both a praise for Newton and a sort of a scolding, like, you also have to look at the world as it really is now, you know. So that's why the Romantics reacted against that and show both sides that it was like, you have to, and pantheism was really a respond, looking at nature again in itself. So in some sense, we're left with the fact that God is already withdrawn. He's done it. We better do our thing to find out what the world really is. It's not the same God, the same gods as in the ancient world, where God is always interfering, is present right there. It's like
Mhm.
it's sort of almost in your face. So the withdrawal of God, that was part of our problem. Is not that, we became so egotistical that, like we're going to displace God. No, he withdrew, and we're left with this mess, and we got to figure it out. And so I think that's part of the movement of the scientific revolution. So you gotta give mankind a break. Like what are we gonna do? God left. I mean, you better do something. You better figure out what the hell's going on. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, certainly it's very different, the two that you're describing. On the one hand, the sacred that is everywhere all the time. Everything that happens everywhere shows the hand of the sacred. Every household has the sacred in it, versus God set it all in motion and doesn't change his mind about how it works. And so
the romantic tried to bring that back.
yeah, but you can see the difference and
Yeah.
how it could make people feel lonely,
Yeah.
right? Because normally every single thing that happens, God is there. But under the new deistic framework, God could have left, and he just said the wind-up clock mechanism universe. It caused a crisis in philosophy and religion and society in general, and we're still in that crisis to this day. So anyway, thanks for bringing that up. Michelle, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I think the answer of does God exist has just been answered on the screen, the Will screen in particular, because we had a feline friend pop up in to say hello. And as we all know, the kitty cats, every individual one of them likes to know and believe that they are God and should be worshipped as such, and every entitlement given to them as such. So,
Yes.
but I'm wondering when Christianity was popularized in Rome, did it adopt the Highlander initiative? There can be only one.
Yeah, that seems to be the dates that Stephen's talking about, when first they introduced the idea that there's just the one thing, there will be no more public, exercise of pagan religions, and then a generation later there won't be any private exercise of pagan religions. That appears to be the turning point, because before that we don't really see evidence of that.
Can I get those years again?
He said 393 was the banning of public performance of pagan religion.
And then wasn't 2 years after that, around a year after that, 396 or 397, was when the Christian Bible was printed by the Council of Nicaea came together in 396 or 397 AD.
Right, to settle various religious doctrine issues.
Right.
Because once you say there can be only one, now you have to get your act straight as far as, well, what is that one? So there's a sort of a scramble that happens to pin down some open theological questions. So it's interesting, but it's a massive transformation. So, I'd say that has as much claim to be if we wanted to use a notional dividing line between ancient and medieval, 393 has as much claim as the later fall of Rome. So let's take this back to the text then. With all of this context that we've built up together, let's finish the first half of sentence 2. Prayer within the polis was a public thing because religion was for the sake of political intelligence. And then he goes on, as philosophy too was intended to galvanize acuity for public affairs as the very acme of strictly human concerns. So the purpose of philosophy wasn't to, have deep thoughts. Wow, man, you ever thought, you really looked at your hands? I mean, it wasn't this private hobby exercise thing. And it wasn't to get a degree so that you could teach philosophy. It was the purpose as the ancient Greeks saw it was philosophy and religion were two sides of the same coin. Religion was expected to be philosophical and philosophy was expected to be religious, because both of them dealt with the most ultimate matters of human existence. And who are we? What is the nature of change? Do we have free will, or are our fates predetermined? What is the good? What is the right thing to do? All of these and related questions are the meat and potatoes of philosophy, and they're also the meat and potatoes of religion. And it makes sense because as we recall from Kenneth Smith's earlier writings in chapter 4, he says that the purpose of the Aristos, the adult, mature Homo sapiens mind that's capable of not being trapped by either of the mental faculties, that can treat them as a dialectic and distance itself from them and think about sophrosune, what's actually good and healthy for people. That mindset and the caste associated with it, the ancient Greeks believed existed in order to practice anthropoculture, to cultivate the population at large, to increase the number of people who are able to think at that level. And that was most persuasively, effectively done through the form of myths. Myths weren't what they are today. They weren't lies. They weren't stories. They weren't entertainment. They weren't proto-science. They weren't any of those things. Myths were attempts to make as persuasive as possible the deeper insights into human development and our relationship with nature that would make it easier for people to pursue excellence, easier for people to be suspicious of their appetites and their ideologies, right? That this was the role of the Aristoi, that this was the role of governance, was to increase the ratio of people who could actually make it to an adult mind. So religion, philosophy, these things are tightly bound together in the ancient schema. Because they're both about the same thing. They're about sophrosune. And sophrosune, when talking about human beings, is different from sophrosune when talking about any other species of life on the planet. They're all born with sophrosune. They just have it. But Homo sapiens, as Aristotle says, is the species that distinctively lacks sophrosune. We don't have the compass in the brain. We're as likely to get excited about ecocide and genocide as we are about doing the right thing. Enthusiasm. We're creatures of enthusiasms. As Shakespeare says, for man is a giddy thing. God knows what we're going to be excited about next, but it's going to be something. And it's unlikely to be the right thing, the healthy thing, but it'll be something. So, how do you channel all that enthusiasm in the direction of sophrosune? You have to be persuasive. You have to rivet people's attention. You have to capture their imagination. And this is what they saw as the role of mythos and religion. It's all of this backstory, these previous three sentences before, the sentence 11 of paragraph 14, sentence 1 of paragraph 14, sentence 1 of paragraph 15, these things that we've shared, these are all talking about this backdrop of this mindset that religion doesn't exist because a God from beyond space and time commands you, do what I say or you die. That's more of a medieval perspective. The ancient perspective is people have a natural characterological flaw, and this is how we address that flaw. It's like Alcoholics Anonymous for Homo sapiens, where it's not about alcohol, it's about our inability to muster sophrosune, right? The alcoholic can't muster sophrosune when it comes to the bottle, as I know from my genetics, but the ancient Greeks believed Homo sapiens in general cannot muster sophrosune anywhere consistently. Sometimes we hit it by accident, but in general, we don't know where it is. We're lacking the arrow to point to it. And so we need to throw all of our creativity and our cultural engineering, say the Greeks, in the direction of helping to find sophrosune and cultivate people who are competent to do it for the next generation. So that's why he's linking philosophy and prayer in here when he's talking about the ancient perspective on religion. So let's go on to the second, and then that's why he says it's the very acme of strictly human concerns. That is, it's not a transcendental issue. It's not about what happens after you die. It's about the problems we have right here and now with the choices that people make. When Heraclitus says it would not be better for men if they got exactly what they wanted, this is what he's talking about. We want the wrong things. We lack sophrosune. But if we cultivate our culture correctly, it will make it easier for more people to simulate sophrosune, to more often get enthusiastic about the things that matter. And then maybe we can be a going concern as a species. This is what he means by strictly human concern. So the second half of that sentence I'll share now in the text. He says, as vital as the survival of oneself or one's family was, all that much more vital was it that the political community, the polis, should be steered, governed, according to the highest values, i.e. sophrosune, right? What does Heraclitus say? He says, Sophron arete megiston. He says, sophron is the greatest virtue. And sophron is knowing what you shouldn't be enthusiastic about, knowing the things you shouldn't do. It's half of sophrosune. It's the negative half, where phronesis is the positive half. So the highest value, says Heraclitus, is that ability to say, I might be feeling excited about this, but nevertheless, it's the wrong thing to focus on. I should be focusing on this other thing that's going to be healthier for us as a species and a society and to weave us into the world. He says, and for the sake of the most ample good, a whole people could attain. So this is just reiterating. You should, at this point, as we see how he uses these loaded terms, we can sort of see how it's all weaving together into this core concept, which a number of things that in the modern world we think of as separate, unrelated topics, to the ancient Greeks are part of a single central system of meaning based around nature and its laws, based around human nature and its core defect, and based around what do we have to do as a culture in order to bridge the gap between that defect in human nature and harmonizing with the larger nature so we can succeed. This is the core of their philosophy and the core of their religion. That's what he's saying here in sentence 2. And that's why religion has to be public, because it's a public good, like clean water or clean air. Without it, you can't survive. You have no polis. Does this all make sense so far? Does it cohere? Do you sort of see the picture that he's drawing of the ancient conception of religion? Because he's about to contrast. So I'll drop the next sentence in. Christianity, by contrast, fostered. Oh, go ahead.
It's not a single individual thing. It sounds like he's indicating that it's the polity or the entire community should be involved and have the same goals.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's not about whether I'm going to die and go to heaven because I've done all these good things. It's about whether or not the community as a whole has contributed to this concept.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, that's right on the money. I mean, the Greeks are haunted by this issue of cosmos versus chaos. Right? Not law and order versus chaos, because they see law and order as being capable of being the same as chaos. If everybody's marching in the wrong direction, to the Greeks, that's a chaos. Even if they're doing it lawfully in an organized fashion, that's still no good. You might as well have them fighting each other. Because at least if there's diversity of opinion, maybe somebody in that mix is pointing in the right direction. But if you've got everybody behaving in an organized fashion and together they're all marching off the cliff together, that's worse. It's also a form of chaos to them. So to them, the opposite of chaos is cosmos. And cosmos is the word that the ancient Greeks used for the old original archaic fighting units with which they invaded the Greek peninsula and took over, right? When the Indo-Europeans came in from Far Eastern Europe and they migrated through, and dropped down into the Greek peninsula and conquered the indigenous peoples there and set up their caste system, where the indigenous peoples were slaves and had to work for them. They believed that the reason they had a right to conquer was because they were capable of acting as a cosmos. That gave them their right to rule. That gave them their right to win, to survive. They believed that was them harmonizing with the larger universe by learning to act not just as individuals, but as a group that could react as a group, that could do the right thing as a group. And that's their definition of cosmos. A cosmos is when many organisms work together as a single organism that has sophrosune, that knows what you should do and what you should not do to be healthy and vital and fit into the larger universe. All of that definition together makes up a cosmos. And so to them, all of these issues of religion and philosophy and character are about what does it take for us to form this cosmos? So this certainly transcends the individual. I mean, an individual can't form a larger cosmos. They're just an individual. You certainly hope that the cells and systems in your body will form a cosmos that at least makes you an individual. Otherwise, you have cancer or, breakdown of systems or what have you, which you're well familiar with right now, Geneva, right? I mean, when you've got that kind of chaos, you got to stop it. You got to create a cosmos
Right.
again.
Yeah.
So they
Well, but
saw,
that kind of explains then how we ended up with organized religion in a
Yes.
sense. Because
Yeah.
now you've got people saying we've got to get together and all go in the same direction. But like you said, if you're all going off the damn cliff, there's still chaos.
It's still a chaos.
It's still a chaos. You haven't reached the cosmos.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, because to moderns we make these distinctions like law and order versus chaos that have not in which the question of sophrosune is completely absent. It's like sophrosune isn't even a thing to a modern. We don't have the word, we don't have the concept. We think the important thing is to be free to do whatever you want to do and to collect the power that will allow you to do that thing and fulfill your dreams. And there's Heraclitus saying, "Dear God," but the question is, are your dreams healthy dreams? Are you dreaming of doing the right thing for your species and for all of life on Earth, as well as for you as an individual? Or are you having cancerous dreams in which you're fantasizing about, everybody does what I say whenever I say it, in which case you're creating a chaos, not a cosmos. It's Aristotle's writing on the Constitution when he says, a monarchy and an aristocracy and a healthy sophrosune-based democracy are more like each other as forms of government, despite the fact that one of them is only one person in charge, one of them is a few, and one of them has many. They're still more like each other than a monarchy is like a tyranny, even though in both cases you just have one guy in charge. He says the difference is a tyranny, there's no sophrosune. Having one guy in charge with sophrosune, says Aristotle, is infinitely better than having the entire population have the vote if not a single one of them has sophrosune, because they're all just going to run off in the wrong direction. So somebody should find the sophrosune and lead us to it and teach other people to find it. And that's the most important consideration. He says it's the highest value. Nothing's more important than that, says Aristotle. It's what everything should be based on. But to us, we can't even name the thing that he thinks is important. We have to borrow the term from the Greeks. We don't have the idea. So that's why for them it's a public thing. We're trying to form the cosmos. If we're ancient Greeks, that's what we think religion's for. And it's the critical nuance before I call on Phil is that the way the Greeks imagine forming a cosmos is not to form a groupthink. It's the opposite of that. They want an education in which everybody's diverse arete get cultivated to allow them to grow in the different directions that give them different gifts and different perspectives. They don't want everybody to have the same perspective. They just want everybody to care about sophrosune and then to use their diverse perspectives to approach it from different angles. They say that's what's most likely to help us survive. So it's an interesting dialectic between unity and diversity that we kind of don't have. We get stuck on, well, if people think different things, then isn't that chaos? Shouldn't we all think the same thing? And of course, that one versus many thing that we're stuck on causes us to not understand sophrosune, even when it's introduced to us, because we're like, oh, so everybody should think the same thing. And there's the Greeks going, oh, dear God, no, no, you need diversity. You need diversity. You just need this shared passion for doing what's healthy and vital and good for us all. So it's really interesting stuff. It's an interesting model. Thanks, Geneva. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
This throws a really important rethinking of the word piety to me. It seems to me, piety, we really think, you usually think of like there's these all-powerful gods or whatever it is. We got to be humble and pious in relationship to him or her, because we just got a minuscule part of our understanding than the gods. But this spin on piety to me has to do with more with a kind of humility, but a deeper sense of humility, understanding there's a flaw within all of us. We lack something. It almost seems like, the Christians and the Jews also, probably the Muslims as well, plus the Buddhists, everything. It just seems like there is a shade of fallenness within all of us. We can't quite do it. So therefore, no matter how much we think we've got it, we ain't got it. So we have to be humble about that. And piety is the thing that teaches that we ain't got it after all. I'm wondering whether there's any religion that actually says, we're great. I mean, when you look at it in a funny analytical way, I mean, human beings are better than all the other animals. Yeah, they can't jump higher, they can't do all sorts of things. But why isn't there a religion that says, no, we are the best? Rather than, like, I don't think a tiger or whatever is going to say, we got to be humble about what we do. I mean, it's like only human beings has reached a level of saying, no, we have to be really humble and understand that we are in a fallen state. Rather than comparing ourselves, oh, yeah, we're in a fallen state, so is every other animal or living thing in the world. Because they don't like it, we could just go chop down that tree. I mean, like, see what I'm saying? It's like, how is it the human beings on the one level, it's a highest evolution of a species, and yet we have an understanding that we ain't got it. We are still fallen. Is there any religion that does not seem to say that there is a fallenness within all of us in some sense, and we have to be humble and actually think that we could become better? I mean, that seems very, very interesting. And I think have a sense of humility, You could be the best basketball player in the world. You could say, yeah, but I could be better, Yeah, I'm humble about it. I'm learning, that sort of thing. It's like, yeah. So that's interesting. So piety is really self-directed internally rather than looking at the gods or whatever, and say, oh God, we're just puny little spectacle. Maybe if you look at the whole universe, you could wonder, like, we are not even a speck on a speck on a speck. That's how small we are. I mean, it's like, yeah, we have to be humble and pious because we ain't got it. We might know a lot of things, but we ain't got it. We are fallen still. So yeah, that's very interesting that human beings in general, certainly Buddhism understands that, you have to be pious and humble in spite of the fact, and in fact, the Buddha in his deathbed pleaded with his disciples, please don't turn me into a god.
Yes,
And of
yes.
course, they immediately turned him into a god.
Immediately.
Right. So, like, yeah, you shouldn't be so humble, Buddha. You are a god. No, he didn't want that. So that's very interesting. Please don't turn me into a god.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I love that. And you can see from the ancient Greek perspective, there's a direct relationship between whether egotism or arrogance is a virtue or a vice, connected to whether or not you have sophrosyne. I mean, the cheetah is proud. You could tell by its behavior. It loves to run. It loves to be fast. And it's appropriate because it has sophrosyne. It's using its speed the way that it should be using its speed for it to survive, for its species to survive, for the Serengeti to survive. It all works together. And so the egotism, to such an extent as it has any, is appropriate. The problem for Homo sapiens is we get egotistical about stuff that is not of survival value, but we get, oh, so proud of ourselves for it. So you can see why one of the functions of religion is to say, well, if we have this defect, we've got to put some controls in place. And one of the first controls we can put in place is, let's describe what something that didn't have our flaws would be like. I'd like to introduce you to Jesus. It's like, I'd like to introduce you to Buddha. Here's some people you should be thinking about when you're thinking you're hot shit. It's like, yeah, but look at this guy. And then you go, oh, yeah, okay, maybe not. And it's, for example, in the traditional Okinawan martial arts dojo, the sensei plays that role. Even though he's not a divine figure, he's been doing it for decades and you haven't. You know, any kata you can imagine trying to learn, or every technique you can imagine trying to learn, he's so much better at it than you are. And it's not a matter of opinion. I mean, you know, you can get out there and spar, and, you know, this little 60-year-old guy is flipping, you know, 6-foot guys with no effort whatsoever, whereas you can't seem to get a grip on the guy. So you're like, okay, obviously there's something better than me. Obviously there's something better than me. And that's good because it encourages me to improve myself. And the problem with, you know, a cheetah's enthusiasm about its speed leads directly into the cheetah wanting to practice speed more. The problem with human beings is we pride ourselves on being great at something and then we get lazy. So I don't have to work at it anymore. I'll just sit back here and be the best.
Well, you gotta remember Mr. Miyagi. You know, when he was in
Yes.
Okinawa with the Karate Kid,
Yes.
and he saw, I guess his brother-in-law, whoever, could break a piece of wood, and so he asked him, "Could you do that?" He says, "Mr. Miyagi says, don't know, never fought tree."
Yeah, that's right. I haven't had a big problem with trees attacking me, so, you know. No idea. I don't know what you've got against trees there, buddy. Thanks, Phil. Hey, Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, no, I mean, something, this will be brief. It's just something that you had said that, you know, kind of struck me is that, you know, the whole time we've been talking about it, you know, kind of from, and this text is written like this, so that there's a reason as to why we're having conversation mostly about Christianity. But even just thinking about it when you were talking about how it's not groupthink necessarily, and how it takes, you know, kind of, it takes the best of all perspectives. So I think it's important with that, you know, that in mind, to look at it from a perspective of how belief systems overall had emerged in, you know, places like in Asia, in particular, something like Confucianism, and kind of seeing how the idea that it was in a way trying to get you to understand, or, you know, appreciate what is truly good and what is worth pursuing. It was really mostly focused on education, but there were a set of rules that you actually had to abide by. You know, specifically with you know, kind of, you know, funeral ceremonies, and where you had to mourn for 3 years, and some of the things like that. And it's also interesting to look at it from a Taoist perspective, you know, where there is this universal principle. And when you look at it, you know, it's very much aligned with the, I mean, well, maybe this may be an oversimplification, but it does seem to align with the logos in a way. And so that in a sense that it is there's this governing principle of the universe. I mean, I know that's a gross oversimplification, but anyway, that's you know, one way of looking at it. But I mean, when I think that this highlights the problem that it exists when you are only focused on one belief system. You know, I don't know who said it earlier about the idea that there's that, you know, when did it become one belief system? And that eventually, obviously, may instill a certain amount of order for a very short period of time, but it's not sustainable. And it ultimately, when you're talking about, you know, kind of, you know, dogmatic religious beliefs, it's only a matter of time before you have people that are going to rebel against it and reject it. Just as they rejected the previous system that they had because there's corruption that gets involved in the hierarchy. Anyway, so I think that what I'm saying is that that's a lack of perspectives being incorporated ultimately. And so that's really kind of an important part, I think, to kind of think about, at least from, not just in the Western context, but also to think about this in, from a variety of different belief systems.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, there's a pair of books out there. One of them is very short, by Sri Aurobindo, and the other one is longer and by a much more famous author, and I'm having noun flight at the moment. I can't remember his name. He was a Persian Sufi author. And both of them explore the idea that Heraclitus's logos and Lao Tzu's Tao influenced each other across the Silk Road. Because they're writing about the same time, but thousands of miles apart. You're like, well, how could they possibly, have come up with these ideas at the same time? And the answer is, well, they weren't as isolated as we think they were. There was a Silk Road running the whole length, from China up through the Tigris and Euphrates and into modern day Turkey. And Ephesus is on the coast, of Turkey. And so, it could easily be that there was communication, not letters or anything, but, ideas were passing back and forth across the Silk Road even over that distance. And people were reflecting on, as they came to understand the world better, they were reflecting on, there seems to be some kind of unconscious intelligence in the world that makes things act in a patterned, profound way. And that maybe we should be updating our religions and philosophies to take that into account. It's so, these ideas had some currency. I'll before next week, I'll try to look up. I've got both of the books in question. I'll try to remind myself the author of the second book, the larger one. But yeah, these ideas also help with overcoming ego. It's part of, a lot of people have used Taoism and Heraclitean ideas to get this deeper idea that intelligence doesn't require a single neuron. The relationship between the Douglas fir and the Douglas squirrel and the fungi that interpenetrate the roots of the Douglas fir and spread throughout the forest. They have a kind of intelligence. There's a networking, non-neural intelligence at work that causes them to do more or less the right thing. The product of evolution rather than decision. And that intelligence is successful more often than this intelligence is. I mean, I think it's, trying to remember, I had his name just a second ago, the playwright, who said, except for the first 9 months of his life, no human being organizes his affairs half so well as a tree does. It's like the ways that we bungle and screw up. We need the corrective to remind us to look beyond what we're enthusiastic about or what we're ideologically attached to or parochially experienced, to think about, are there smarter, better, wiser, healthier choices available to us? And if they are, how do we change ourselves to want to do those things?
Yeah, and just, I think it's I'm jumping ahead, but I don't have the text directly in front of me, but, I think that one interesting part is kind of where the religions start to become dependent on rhetoric.
Yeah.
And we'll get to that. So, I'm not going to jump too far ahead, but that's, I think, a very important point when we're talking about, kind of how these ideas have become institutionalized, and they become, kind of means of of control. And so, anyway, I'm not going to go. Anyway.
Yeah, well, it's like, the religion, when it is a living, vital organism, when it's a living, vital organism that's filled with the juices of life, like it is when the Greeks are fighting against the Persians, is a great power. that can make a David and Goliath story happen. But by the time it becomes empty forms, like you're describing, when it becomes a hollow doll, just a shell, like by the late Roman Empire, then it's just waiting for someone to just give it the right tap and it falls over. Some other religion is ready to replace it. Can move in. It's this is a. I don't spend a lot of time quoting Marx, but there's times when Marx is apposite, and one of them is his core idea, which you wouldn't know from studying the writings of many Marxists who claim to love his work. But unlike a lot of Marxists, Marx says, what brings an epoch to an end is not that some revolutionary group overthrew it. That's not how it works. The way that it works is that every civilization, its strengths are also its weaknesses. They become the seeds of its own destruction. It contains internal contradictions. And the same thing that allowed it to flourish in the beginning is the thing that's going to strangle it in the end. So that, ultimately each of these epochs takes itself down. So ancient religion, by the time Christianity's on the rise in the late Roman Empire, it's become a hollow doll. It doesn't have the life that it once had. And defeating it is mostly a matter of overcoming an enormous amount of investment and inertia rather than winning a difficult argument. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Just going to bring up, I was wondering, Rick, if you can answer the Euphrode dilemma for me. But this is what I'm sort of talking about, that I wonder about this axial age transition to a Socratic rationality, which somehow wasn't there more in the past. In the past, people were operating on a different level, but sort of from about the time of Socrates, we have a type of rationality we can understand. But I mean, of course, it creates a dilemma, Is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? We're dealing with a type of causation here. Now, somehow, prior to Socrates, this question didn't appear so strongly. It just wasn't on people's minds. They're operating on a different level. For example, you get the impression with these ancient mysteries that when people had a mental problem, they engaged in some sort of ritual practice where they connected themselves with the bonds of nature or whatever it was. The mind wasn't seen as something so separate from nature. They interacted, but Socrates' rationalism comes along and it's abstracted the mind to the point where it's no longer part of nature. And I'd just love to get the goods on what was the type of mind that existed before Socrates. What was going on? Because we live in a world that's become dominated by that type of rationalism.
Yeah.
Everyone's talking about a rationalism, but today we face a different type of transition in that the old God is thrown out. And as Max Stirner complained to Feuerbach, all you've done is you've thrown out the old God and you're trying to institute this new human God above me, this God of humanity, this God of humanism. You're appropriating my property because my human property is my own possession. How dare you create a generality which is above me? So this sort of modern cults of a sort of they're trying to create a set of virtues that people must live by, which are perfect, the humanists. And it's become a cult of reason. They believe that that reason can come up with every answer.
Right.
This is one of the things we live with at the moment. The thought, the answers are in the intellect. we'll come up with the ultimate conclusion in the intellect. Now, you get the impression from Nietzsche, he's saying, yeah, rationality has a place, but ultimately what you're going to build is a tombstone. If you try to make everything completely and utterly rational, you'll create living death.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, this seems to be the problem. But this modern cult seems to be involved in the contradiction between facts and philosophic values. Now, the philosophic term value means, for example, our moral values. Everything which is not a fact. It's a fact that I can eat babies, but my value says I can't eat babies. Do you get the trick there? Our values, a philosopher will say, well, yeah, I know there's facts, we have values, but we probably couldn't have a culture without these immaterial values, these subjective values. We know that there's objective facts, but yeah, we can't exist without subjective values. You have, even if the values of different cultures are contradictory, they're all living by some set of values. Now, and this gets to the Euphrode dilemma. You had this idea of a perfect God. This perfect God created the facts, which are objective, which we can observe and generally agree on, not always. And then there's the values which we can't establish objectively. They're subjective, but for the old religious believers, doesn't matter. God guarantees the facts. He created the material universe, the objective universe that was created by God. And also our values are created by God. Kant sums up when he says, the two things which inspire him are the starry heavens above, the cosmos, the objective cosmos, and the moral law within.
Uh-huh.
So says Kant. But what do you think of the problem with the Euphrode dilemma, Rick? You must have spent some time working on that one.
Yeah, but not productively. I mean,
oh, okay.
I wonder if it's a feedback loop. It's like, at the point that we are in our lives and in history, how are we ever going to know how it started? Because at this point, they're both influences. Certainly, you can see how the story of from the Bible, the faithful man of God who was tormented by the devil,
Job, is it?
Job, to prove his faith would seemingly be a counterexample. But I mean, half the reason for the story of Job is to show an example of someone behaving in a remarkably unnatural way, because most people start cursing God pretty swiftly when they're just a few steps into Job's path. His is not the usual reaction.
Yeah,
So
well, that's the question. But one of the points was Job was complaining to his fellows. They said, "Oh, you must have sinned in some way," and he said, "I haven't." The point is that he's suffering not due to sin.
right.
It's not because he actually has sinned that he's suffering. Many ancient cultures would have said, if you're suffering, you must have sinned.
Right. Must be your
He's
agency
saying,
at fault.
yeah, and he's saying, no, I didn't sin. I shouldn't be condemned because I haven't sinned. And then later on, God restores his world.
Right.
Of course,
Right.
him being the head of the household is the only thing that's important. His previous wife and children didn't matter so much. They got
I know.
replaced.
Do they now go through life with the memory of the horrific things that happened to them? Have they too been
I think
rewarded
they
in every
died.
way? I mean, God. I think I think about how Donald and others have talked about, like in the Republic, the way that it opens with them walking down to the Piraeus. And the modern reader just glosses over that. But to the person of Plato's time, that might be the most important sentence in the whole book, because that sets the context. In the same way that or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? I'm put in mind of something Kenneth Smith notes, that's Nietzsche and others have noted about the Greeks, which is that the favorites of the gods tend to have the most horrific lives. To be noticed by the gods and singled out is to have things happen to you like Paris and Helen and Achilles and Hector. It's like it's to go into the meat grinder and become an example for future generations, not necessarily to be rewarded with, Santa Claus giving you all the goodies. So I wonder, and Socrates would have known that. Plato would have known that. It was a truism in their day that you hope not to be noticed and singled out by the gods because of how often tragedy follows in your footsteps. So when he asks this, is it pious because it is loved by the gods? I wonder if there isn't an extra charge there of the kind Donald likes to point out from time to time that adds some deeper irony to this question that is not apparent on the surface.
Well, one huge thing which has changed is these ancient cultures felt that they weren't the be all and end all of everything in the universe.
Right.
They felt man was a creature in the middle. There were things below man, but there were forces above man.
Mm-hmm.
And man was a cog in the big machine.
Yeah.
But our modern culture has made the virtuous man or whatever the penultimate.
Right.
Our sort of modern humanism doesn't think that there is anything. They believe that their humanism is the universal law.
That's as good as it gets, they think.
There's nothing above it.
Right. Which is, why we've got centuries of nihilism now.
Well, it's a type of hubris. The ancients would have called this the most extreme form of hubris.
It's the invitation to catastrophe. Next up, Ate. Here comes devastation and destruction. Yay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. It's a great question, and I think we should keep pondering it from session to session. This can be another one like how Fenris was leashed that we can come back to, because I think there's some juicy stuff in this Euthyphro example, the dilemma. James, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
No, thanks, Rick. Hey, everybody. So, are you saying that the that Sophrosine is to find that balance between the existence of the world and the transcendent? Because man is between earth and heaven, right?
Yes.
And
so
heaven would be the metaphysical realm where we don't have that much knowledge of, right?
Well, the Greeks don't really believe in the sacred transcending the natural. This is one of the ways they differ from the medievals, is to them, the sacred is part of the natural. It's the natural operating at its best.
Right.
So, but otherwise, yeah, that Sophrosune has to do with being able to detect how to weave yourself into the greater harmony.
Right. So if you do not have to project into the transcendent realm, into the heavens, this idea of God, then you'd have more of a sense of balance, as Sophrosine. So so the problem is this kind of projection of one's ego, perhaps, into the transcendent realm in the form of a God. And would you agree that that's kind of a projection? What God is a kind of projection of one's logos and one's ego?
From the ancient Greek perspective, you mean?
Yeah. But of course they had many gods, right?
Yeah, and then they would see them. I mean, I think from the ancient Greek perspective, there's a couple of issues here. At the simplest level, we'd have to say, yeah, they're a projection. The sacred, to the ancient Greeks, the sacred is a projection above humanity of the direction in which we ought to be striving, the things we ought to be attending to and being aware of. But I'm still digesting F.M. Cornford's ideas in From Religion to Philosophy and in Thucydides Myth Historicus, where he says that the Olympian religion that includes gods among the ancient Greeks was a later superstructure built on top of an older Greek religious foundation that didn't have any gods. And in that older foundation, it was a lot more like Shintoism. It was a what we might call a daimonism, in which there are daimones of every tree, of every rock, of every spring, of every mountain. We're just like in a cosmos filled up to overflowing with daimones, and that they're the source of meaning and pattern in the cosmos.
Right.
And that the Greeks constructed their Olympian religion atop that and believed in it for a while. But Cornford argues that by the time of the Peloponnesian War, there's abundant evidence that philosophers, historians, and others are beginning to no longer fully believe in the Olympian religion. They're sort of beginning to shed it as the artifice that it was, kind of a construction, but that they're consciously or unconsciously falling back on the older daimon religion, the Shinto-like daimon religion. And both of those things, so you could say not just the gods, but these this concept of daimones as an attempt to project into a comprehensible form this pattern that they're detecting in nature, that there is this hidden harmony, there are these deeper archi that are fountains of order and meaning, and that they need to pay attention to those things or else that they'll get in trouble.
Right. Because yeah, Joe mentioned Taoism and some of the Eastern, religions, Confucianism. And I'm in this group reading a book called Experiments in Atheistic Mysticism. I put a link in here in the, and it's interesting because it goes into the development of philosophy in Chinese culture, and this kind of historical development from Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism, and later more recent scholars combine those into a philosophy based on this idea of atheism, because they're without gods, but it works because it combines these different philosophies and acknowledge that in nature there are these forces, the qi in nature, and then there's the li, the forms, what we call the forms, but those are like the principles of structure, and so it seems to make sense, and but you don't have to have any gods involved. You don't worship any gods, but you also have ancestor worship, because we acknowledge that there is really somehow the ability to transcend death, to acknowledge that there is life after death, because that's part of nature, the natural process of production and reproduction, and so we're all part of that productive, reproductive process. We are produced and we are also productive.
Yes.
Like everything else. And so that's very interesting that, that, would you say that that's a form of Sophrosine?
Well, it's certainly, it's an attempt to construct, I think of it like a prosthesis. They're trying to create a conceptual prosthesis that we can use emotionally and intellectually to substitute for the missing Sophrosine. It's like a Sophrosine approximation.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm glad you're bringing up these subjects. It's something that I want to do repeatedly over the course of the next year and a half. Is I want to bring in a lot more Chinese, Japanese, and say from India as well, some of their medieval worldviews and religions, and compare and contrast them with the Christian medieval worldview. Because it's fascinating to me that China and Europe are worlds apart at that point in history, and yet we have the Chinese medieval mandate of heaven going on at the same time that we have the medieval divine right going on. Somehow, this medieval conception of a religious-centric or sacred-centric political economy has arisen on nearly opposite sides of the planet in completely different forms, right? As you point out, Confucianism doesn't even have gods, and yet they've still got a mandate of heaven. And the same kind of sense that the sacred needs to rule over mundane political matters. It's just fascinating to explore. How did that arrive?
Right.
Sort of in the same way, but also differently in such widely separated
Yeah,
places.
somehow the mandate of heaven is not there's no purposive, entity or God. It's purposeless. And so we are each one of us as individuals, act and live according to some purpose.
Yes.
But we are derived from this kind of realm of the purposeless, and somehow there's meaning in that, even though we we admit that we don't have a purpose ultimately, that the mandate of heaven is without purpose, and somehow that's enough, that we
Yeah.
can survive and produce and reproduce, and that's all the meaning that we need somehow.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, thanks, James. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Stephen Hickson. That's what's on my mind. What? Stephen?
Yes.
Yes. What do you find so puzzling in this quote from? I'll be really pedantic. My Greek professor, the Germans, people who had studied German would say oithufro, and the English would say euthyphro, and he would say Greek does not combine the eta and the upsilon, and it is euthyphro, and you need to learn that. I'm going to say euthyphro, because if I go euthyphro, nobody going to pay any attention. But this question, I haven't read the euthyphro in some time. I kind of know where it fits in my thinking, though, that this is a puzzle primarily because Euthyphro, this guy who's Socrates runs into, that's going off to the courts to process a case or prosecute a case against his own father. The dialogue doesn't make much progress on piety because Euthyphro hasn't got a clue what it is. And you can have Socratic dialogues all you like with clueless people. But if you think at the end, the answer pops out because it's not, I don't think that happens. And in this case, I think for Socrates, it's pretty clear. Both Socrates and Plato and the gods love the good. That makes them pious.
Well, this is a question for the modern atheists will say, look at we were taught about the perfect, all-powerful God, and of course the modern atheists will say, oh well, look how wicked this God of the Bible was.
Right.
So that's the question: is is goodness a reflection of the gods, and the very existence of the God is the highest principle? Or are there abstract principles of goods beyond the all-powerful God?
Right. Well, I think you're quite right about how modernity or modern Christianity or whatever would say that God by having an omnipotent will, he makes whatever he loves good. But I can't see Socrates coming down on that side of the question for a lot of reasons. One, he doesn't think much of all-powerful gods. If they're not something that he dealt with.
I
And
don't
I,
think
and I,
he had an all-powerful God.
he didn't. He didn't. None of the Greeks
That was
did.
a new invention at the time.
So,
This is the
so,
point.
so they clearly couldn't make things good by loving it. You know, they didn't. They just didn't have that power. So this question, I think, really is Socrates exposing Euthyphro's cluelessness. But I think this dialogue does have something, that there is a place in our lives for piety. That I think I said a couple of weeks ago, trying to recast what Auden said about we are lived by powers we don't.
We pretend to understand.
We pretend to understand, right? Thank you, Rick. Well, the world is also populated, the cosmos as an organism is populated by powers that we don't understand. And these powers, depending on their nature, we owe some reverence, some piety towards. I mean, we talk often here about agency and contingency. When we are aiming to do good and our efforts just get knocked aside by some malevolent power that we don't understand, well, that teaches us something, maybe humility, or when something ill-formed that we're trying to will turns into good. I don't know, but there are powers, and I think Socrates says we do owe some respect to these forces around us, and that's piety. You know, they're human. I've mentioned this before, and I'm afraid sometimes it just says too much about me and not enough about philosophy, is that, you know, virtue is a characteristic of human action. And, you know, like courage applies to how we act in the face of the unknown future. You know, it's sort of the base thing. For things that we know their natures, to treat them in accordance with their natures is justice. But now we have these other forces, much more powerful and less known, that share the world with us. And for those, we have piety, a sort of piety that we have, you know. So that's kind of what I got out of the Euthyphro. Maybe, you know, if I accept PayPal. If you send it to me, I'll send me a little token of your appreciation, and I'll reread it and see if I want to say anything else on it.
Nice.
You know, you can call me, you know, gorgeous or Protagoras or.
Well, but that's useful, Donald, because you're pointing out this context for Socrates' comment that make it potentially be a kind of trap for Euthyphro to show him that he doesn't understand what he's talking about. You know?
Yeah. Well, Euthyphro fundamentally believes that piety is what he says it is.
Right.
And that he's correct in, you know, his father was trying to do the right thing, captured the thief, bound him up, and then went to notify the appropriate authorities. I think in the intervening time, the thief died as a result of Euthyphro's father trying to do the right thing. So now Euthyphro says, well, now it's up to me to do the right thing. And the right thing is to prosecute my father for having killed this thief or something like that, you know. But in the end, I think Euthyphro is hopeless as a understanding of morals or the deference due to the forces that killed the thief,
Right.
not his father, you
Right.
know, to these other forces to which we would owe some kind of deference. That, hey, you know, I think once I tried to sum up on here that, you know, that I don't like, I don't actually, it's like, I don't believe philosophy ever gets can ever be reduced to just easy rules, you know, or
Right.
something. That the idea is that we come up with, oh gosh, if we follow these 13 commandments or something like that, then we're leading a philosophical life. You know, one, you start living the philosophical life prior to ever becoming philosophical. In fact, you must start the journey. You will start. You can't, there's no other way. Start studying philosophy not knowing what it is. You know, and this is one of the reasons courage, said before, courage is such a key virtue. But now, if you want to say, oh, well, courage is the fundamental virtue on which all other virtues are based. Well, you know, I probably, I think that's not going to help you at all. That learning these little aphorisms, sometimes they can remind you of a reality or of a chain of thought that shows you how, well, I was led astray or not astray, or I'm back to thinking philosophically. But we're not, I know Kenneth,
You're not going
is
to
that,
follow Goethe's warning to keep away from philosophy.
well, what does it make you ill? Or is that
Yeah,
Nietzsche?
apparently. You look at
Nietzsche.
the life of
Nietzsche,
Goethe.
Nietzsche thinks it makes men sick.
Yeah.
I think when he went through the deep philosophical stage, he became suicidal in his youth. And Goethe's life was about how to relate to life itself. You know, if he said that to Hegel. You know, I think somebody, Essential Salt, said it recently, one of his videos, that Goethe said to Hegel, you know, keep away from philosophy, go out for a walk in the forest, something natural.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would say Goethe's a pretty sharp guy because,
Yes.
say if I handed you Logical Positivism by A.J. Ayer, I guarantee you're not going to become philosophical by reading that, and you'd be far better off walking in the woods and breathing. There is much philosophy that will make you sick, make
Yes.
you ill.
Yes.
An aspect of these ancient societies, of course, are hierarchical, and they looked up to their leading citizens. They looked up to their aristos. They didn't expect that the vast bulk of their humanity, the servile class, the Julai class, were examples of the greatest virtue. They didn't see the Banausi as being the great examples of virtue. They had
That's
to
true.
look up to that small percentage of the top. I know I'm a Julai, I'm a Banausi, I have my limitations, but I'm glad that there's somebody up there whose piety is on par with the gods. It makes me feel I can get up in the morning and life is worth living, but we don't have that today.
Do they have orange hair?
Well, we believe that the entire population has to be perfectly good or life is not worth living.
Well,
You're not going to get
what
that.
one of the things I say about the Republic when I'm being funny or trying to be funny is there's really in modernity, if you tried to implement the Republic, there would be this long line of people wanting to be philosopher kings, and there would be no signing up to be philosopher plumbers.
Right.
You know, and what we need a society that can produce philosopher plumbers. At least people who can say, I understand what it means to be well ruled or well guided, that I cannot provide that to others myself, but I could be an honest plumber that really fixes things, that treats my customers fairly. We live in a society where it's hard to find philosopher plumbers. That is,
Everybody wants to be king.
everybody wants to be king, and the plumbers we get want to pad the bill. You know, they get jealous of how, you know, appliance repair guys can rip you off more easily than.
I wish they could do that.
Yeah, they wish they could do that. I don't know.
What
You
does
know,
this
so if you
society
come
aspire to? I mean,
power,
yeah, we live in a
Chaos.
society. Where is the human being that I should aspire to? Where is my Aristos?
That's
I
the
think
problem.
it's,
We don't
you
have
know,
any.
we have a great divide between capitalism and socialism. In capitalism, it's dog eat dog. In socialism, it's the other way around.
The modern world.
The modern world. Oh, all right.
Yeah.
The only thing I think, Stephen, that gives me hope is that we're not immortal.
Okay. Well,
Eventually I will die, and these
This won't be our problem anymore.
and it won't.
I think the risk
These
is
things won't bother me at all.
I think the risk is that moderns think they're smart. I think this is the point, isn't it?
Yes.
But we are still stuck with dilemmas.
Yes. Yes.
And we're doing stupids as well, and we think we're smart. We think
Yes.
we're smarter than the ancients, but so therefore we will do better.
That's
But
right.
we might not be as smart as we think we are.
Oh, maybe we're more like Euthyphro. We're clueless.
Yes.
We have
Yes.
no idea to who we owe deference.
Yes. And you know, it's if you think of the ancient Greek society as desperately pursuing cosmos, trying so hard to overcome chaos and produce cosmos, you could see the modern world as desperately pursuing chaos. So each man for himself. Everybody wants to be the winner. Winners win and losers lose, and nobody wants to be a loser. And the problem is that's not a mindset capable of generating a cosmos. And in between, you've got the medieval epoch, where the goal was to escape the cosmos. We have a transcendental God, a transcendental afterlife, you know, everything. The only thing that mattered is, you know, where are you going to go after all of this? And so there's this weird, we've been in these weird modes for thousands of years where we aren't even trying to structure cultures that can last for centuries or thousands of years. I mean, we haven't been for quite a while. And it makes it difficult to understand what the Greeks are talking about when they're desperately trying to communicate these core ideas that are necessary to understand what a cosmos is, what your value system would have to be like to make you want to make one. And we just read it all as blah, 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 ginger, blah, blah, blah. You know, all you have to do is go to the Wikipedia article on Sofrosune, where they define Sofrosune as practical intelligence and laugh your ass off going, you know, Aristotle is spinning in his grave. It's absolutely not. Practical intelligence is precisely what Sofrosune is not, but one can understand why a modern would have to see it that way. I'm going to call on Joe, and then I'm going to take us through the rest of paragraph 15, which goes fast after this. So Joe, come off mute. Oops, sorry. Do it again. Come off mute again. I muted you.
So I'll just be really quick because I'm actually not in the best place to drive or to speak.
But really, I would like just say, it is interesting because I think that this kind of highlights the important for people to be able to pursue philosophy, and a philosophical approach to life. But I think the point about rules is really important. I mean, because what happens is these rules don't necessarily align with reality at some point. And when they don't, what are you going to do? Right. So then sometimes you just go and ask an authority, and the authority just tells you what aligns with their interests, and somehow that's misconstrued as order. And that's a really important point, because I think that it's easy to subscribe to a I don't know, kind of out of the box almost philosophy of life. But I think Donald was right. It's not a philosophy at that point, because you're not really considering, the circumstances that you're in. And so what that also does, though, is that also kind of leads to a condemnation of other people as well, right? Because when you're not considering circumstances, then all of a sudden, you should be able to do this. You should be able to behave in this kind of way and live this type of way. So, I just think that that's something that's, there was a lot that was just said in that exchange a moment ago. So I'm not going to go on about it, because I thought it was definitely entertaining. But anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Joe. All right, well, here's the end of paragraph 15. This is where he pivots mid-paragraph and shifts us from talking about how the ancients conceive of religion and its relationship to sophrosune and to, anthropoculture and aristoi and mythos culture and all that. He pivots to he pivots to Christianity and by extension medievalism, but at the end of it, he also hops forward to modern distortions of Christianity. So it's or let's say incarnations of Christianity. So he kind of runs around to, sometimes Kenneth does this. For him, modernity and criticizing modernity is a strange attractor in his writing. And sometimes, even if his goal is to talk about medievalism, he'll veer off into modernity. And he does that here. But it's not entirely out of line. So let's walk through it. Christianity, by contrast, fostered an intensively individual sense of prayer, worship, and consultation with God. Right. So private, individual, as opposed to public, which means it's no longer a necessary building block for the polis or for society, the way it was for the ancient Greeks. Now it's a private matter between you and your God about, are you going to heaven or hell? And that has to do with authentically what's in your soul. And he's focusing here on the negative side of that, right? What happens when you remove this underpinning of society that for thousands of years societies have depended on, and you turn it into a private matter? And the answer is, well, something's going to change. Big things are going to shift, and God knows what the consequences are. So there's a huge potential negativity, which is what he's focused on here. But there's something else which is going to come up in the future in these discussions as we move through the medieval chapters, which is private prayer doesn't lend itself as well to vanity. We look at the late Roman Empire, even we look at religion in Athens during the time of the Peloponnesian War, and we see a lot of public spectacle, like we were discussing earlier. But if prayer becomes private, there isn't that opportunity for spectacle. And if prayer becomes private, there isn't that opportunity of going through the empty forms in the hope of reaping social rewards, because nobody can see you doing it. Nobody knows what you're doing. You can't add to your brand the simulation of piety if it's being done quietly in your home instead of in public. And that's the justification for what Matthew says next. And when thou prayest, thou shalt not be as the hypocrites are, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and in the corners of the streets, that they may be seen of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But thou, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly. So there is an inversion of values. This is very Nietzschean, right? I mean, this is a complete revaluation of the value of prayer. taking it out of the political realm, the realm of the polis, and turning it into the private realm, the realm of the oikos, the private home, and turning it into a private affair between you and the gods. The purpose of prayer, and thus the purpose of religion, is completely transformed in this value system that's being presented here. And this is where he veers off from the medieval to the modern when he says Christians in modern society are transparently too much concerned with public show and too dependent on others' rhetoric to be able to comprehend why Jesus would have insisted on such intimacy and candor. It is utterly the extrinsic or worldly and social appurtenances of religion that rule it today. So he's foreshadowing what we're going to get in the final chapters when we talk about modernity, and we see the way in which what was a revolution that turned a public institution of culture, religion, into a private institution, in modernity it's flip-flopped again and gone back to being public. Because if, as Nietzsche says, the modern value system has dethroned God and stuck him at the bottom of the priority list and put mankind and human economies and human assemblies and human reason at the top of the priority list, then the only value religion could have is as it appeals to other human beings, which turns it back into a social thing. You know, what's the social coinage you can get from being publicly religious? And so in the modern world, we see there is this tug of war between people who are what we might say authentically religious, i.e. religious in a pre-modern way, who still want to pray in private, who still care about their relationship with the sacred, versus, you know, as Kierkegaard writes in War on Christendom, vast numbers of people who go through the motions publicly so that they can gain the social credit that comes from having that on your brand, which, you know, modernity is all about the brand. So he kind of jumps ahead there a little bit, but in the first two parts, you know, sentence 3 and sentences 4 through 6, you can see him setting up the contrast between the medieval concept of religion and the ancient concept of religion. And we'll obviously come back to this over and over every chapter as we work our way through the medieval section. So that was it for paragraph 15. We got through all of the paragraph 15 in 1 3-hour session. I know Sharon has got her thumbs up there secretly in the dark, where we can't see her. It's like, yay, the text. We worked our way through the text. And I think that the preamble that we did in the previous week set us up well to be able to understand paragraph 15 and see what his point is that he's making here about the transformation. Remember, and this is the next to last paragraph. There's only one to go, which we'll go through next week, paragraph 16. And all of chapter 5 is about setting up the boldest possible contrasts between the newly emerging medieval worldview and the ancient worldview that it's replacing. And paragraph by paragraph, he's showing these revaluations of values that are happening, and how everything that was a vice becomes a virtue, and everything that was a virtue becomes a vice. The meaning of all the potent words has been turned inside out and transformed. It's a huge change that happens, which is what you'd expect when you change the Roman Empire from being religiously inclusive before 393 to being religiously genocidal after 393. It is a massive change. Nothing like it has happened in the ancient world before when it comes to religion. It's something new on the earth from that perspective. So questions, comments, or concerns to wrap us up in our final 10 minutes? I don't want to take us into paragraph 16 yet, because it's a whole. It really coheres. Yeah, Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
You know, I'm thinking about, you know, the immediate current time, but for a lot of people, say in the 1960s, in the post-war period, there was a strong sense of optimism. There certainly were pessimists always, but for example, you know, you watch the television show Star Trek, and it was full of that sense of 60s optimism that, oh, look, you know, World War II's over. We've got all this technology. We can solve hunger. You know, there's 3 billion people on the planet. We've got petrochemicals. We can feed them all. We can solve all the problems. And I remember reading a book which said somehow that turned around in the 1970s, that a sense of general pessimism arose. And somehow we're still struggling with that today. in some way or other. That optimism which came after a century of technological growth, you went from the primitive steam train to, the jet airliner within the course of a century. It was just huge strides. People felt that technology would solve the problem, but
Yes.
now the problems have grown. The population of the world is almost tripled. And it's no longer the technology is no longer that forthcoming. Will there be an energy problem? They talk about fusion power. Oh, it's just around the corner, it's just around the corner, and it's just around the corner.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, we were born into this optimistic world that we felt that the growth would be never ending. But now we're reaching some things of pessimism. We looked up to the public authorities. We looked up to the institutions. We looked up to the academics. Currently, the population is probably thinking more about tearing the academies down and exiling the academics now.
Right.
There's been quite a turn. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. It's funny, my first exposure to that incredible optimism of the 60s when I was a kid, I was too young in the 60s to sense it. Although I did see the moon landing, I didn't understand the significance because I was very young. But later, I was reading a collected edition of Doonesbury, and there's a number of strips where they're going to a costume party, and one of the costumes at the party is a group of 3 or 4 people who are all coming together and shouting all of their sentences together at the same time, and they announce themselves by saying, "We're the best and the brightest." And they're completely full of optimism, and they're going to change the world and make everything better. And of course, at the time I read it, I had no idea what that was a reference to, but it stuck with me. And then later I learned that was the name that went with Camelot and the JFK administration, and the idea that government could be a force for good, and you could bring together the best and the brightest people of civilization into a government, and it could govern wisely. And it's like that was when I clued in. This whole idea that,
so like King Arthur.
Yeah, that there'd been this idea that you could do that, and boy, these days that's a million miles away from how most of us feel about our government.
With David, we're looking at some Philip K. Dick works.
Yes.
The science fiction author, and of course, he was already in the pessimism before everybody else.
Yes, yes.
And you look into the novels for what is the source of his pessimism. And for example, the commercialization of good and what makes us feel good became so commercialized, and he felt pessimistic.
Yeah. So there always were these countercurrents. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, so I'll just say really quickly, and I'll be brief. I do agree with, and I think that this actually aligns with what Stephen had said earlier. With his previous comments just now. The idea that if you do turn to technology to kind of solve these existential issues, it's not going to work. And this is where I think that the ancients actually have something to teach us. And so, this is the importance of actually, recapturing what the ancients knew, because we fool ourselves with technology. We think we're, capable or more advanced than we actually are. And all it does is exacerbate a problem. And on a very minor scale, micro scale, I can say that this actually often plays out in, large organizations that turn to technology for a solution that it's a fundamental problem in the organization itself. And it's like, well, we have this new system. Why isn't it doing what we thought? It's not doing what you thought because you had problems outside of them, and they're human problems.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's, I think that this just highlights the importance of actually why we ought not dismiss the ancients. And this is the hubris that actually exists in today's world, is that we start to think we have the answers when we truly don't. And life is not simply about technology
Yes.
and materials.
Yes. Yes. I mean, because the ancients have this critique that Walt Kelly so exemplified in the cartoon strip Pogo. We have met the enemy and he is us. It's like the problem is not, that we don't have enough power. The problem is how we wield the power we have. And the solution to that problem is not let's give us more power, because if we're not wielding the power we have wisely, what leads us to believe more power will increase our wisdom? This is not how these things work. As Nietzsche says, power makes stupid. It doesn't make wise. So we have to, take the ancients at their word on this and say, maybe we need to deal with the problem we're carrying with us everywhere we go. And maybe if we solve that problem, then even with the power that we have, maybe we could do more good in the world. It's a possibility. And it's not that the ancients themselves didn't have their problems, but we're able to, if we do the exercise that Kenneth Smith has us doing in this book, we're able to look back on the ancients and reflect on their strengths and weaknesses and try to figure out how to recapture some of the baby that got chucked out with the bathwater. Phil, tell us what's on your mind.
Just very, very quick. I enjoy the comment between Donald and Stephen, but there's one thing that upset me a bit. With Donald, I barely ever get upset when he mentioned the guy with the orange hair. He's got orange hair, and my thought is, you insulting the orangutans. Damn you.
I do love an orangutan. Yes.
So that's it. That's my entire comment.
Thank you, Phil.
Well, Phil, where are all the books and the art that are normally in your background?
We're moving. But there's reason. For the past week and a half, was the only only meeting I attended as yours. Is this one?
Relocating. Yeah. Okay. Well, with that, we're going to wrap up for this week. So I hope you all had a lovely time. I certainly did. And I'm looking forward to talking with you all next week. So have a great week. And next week we'll do chapter 5, paragraph 16. Yay! That will be the end of chapter 5. Take care, everyone.
I'm sure there's chapter 6.
There's certainly